So, once an esteemed colleague from another department said, "What's there in hand transplant? You sit and join big superficial structures." Good morning, I am Devajyoti, and this is a snapshot of our series of 19 patients and their 35 upper extremity transplants. Of these, please note, we were able to go proximally till the shoulder joint in one patient. There were 3 male to female transplants, 2 bilateral and 1 unilateral hand had to be unfortunately explanted, and very, very unfortunately, we lost 3 of those patients. Coming to our very first distal hand transplant, when we go for donor retrieval, please look for, note, and inform your team even subtle signs of trauma or cannulation. Here we missed it and lost crucial ischemia time, which especially in proximal transplants may translate into chronic rejection or worse, limb loss. Only skin incision should be marked. Somebody marked the bone cut on the skin and we ended up with a free flap at 48 hours. So, written surgical steps should be shared with all in the team, including orthopedic colleagues, with their roles predefined. In our second distal forearm, we almost got all things right. At this level, pulvator weave for tendons allow early active mobilization so that further surgeries like adhesiolysis are prevented. Every surgery causes inflammation, which may interfere with immunosuppression and trigger rejection. He went back to defusing bombs in Afghanistan, but was unfortunately killed in action. For our third patient at the proximal forearm level, again things went well. At this level, dissection gets tedious at proximal forearm level and should be done just enough to allow 3 screws in plate. Also, the screw should not impinge. However, he was talked into stopping immunosuppressant by someone. Limb developed chronic rejection and were explanted. In our fourth patient, at the supracondylar level, there was bone diameter discrepancy. A single lateral 4 mm locking dynamic compression plate is enough. And there is diffuse atrophy and contraction of elbow flexors and extensors. Hence, they are repaired at maximum tension with elbow at 90 degrees flexion. Or else, active mobilization may get delayed by 4 to 5 months. Persisting pain, abdomen, and vomiting in follow-up necessitates gastric biopsy to rule out post-transplant lymphoproliferative disease, like in this patient, which is EBV-induced B-cell proliferation treated by B-cell-specific rituximab. Our fifth patient was diabetic. Steroid-free immunosuppressive regimens work well in them. In her too, intrinsic recovery was poor and required secondary procedure. In high-tension electrical burns like our sixth patient, the damage to the vessels can extend to much higher level. We should do preoperative angio and flow rate Doppler to know the exact level and similarly plan the retrieval of additional vessel length. We didn't and fell short on the left side. Tried to salvage with multiple vein grafts multiple times, but as the donor hand had reached very late, even with our best attempts, the left hand had to be explanted. Our seventh case, a quadruple amputee, unusually had immediate bilateral intra-arterial thrombi on both sides, followed by a series of complications and succumbed perioperatively despite our best efforts. Was the immunogenicity of the greater transplanted hand mass compared to the residual body the cause? We don't really know. The 8th patient underwent corneal transplantation for blindness first, and he is doing great. We nearly lost our 9th patient to post-op sepsis. To note was that during the hurried retrieval, as the donor had arrested, one side was not painted before retrieval. It's critical not to miss the basics. In our 10th patient, on the right side was a shoulder level amputation. We were all prepared and transplant went according to the plan. However, we were late in picking up poor perfusion in the right limb due to another zone of trauma at the brachial artery, in addition to the radial artery cannulation. So SpO2 monitoring is crucial. He continues to use the limb as supportive limb. The 11th patient had undergone anti-HBsAg therapy to reduce viral load beforehand. Things went well for him. For our 12th patient, everything was fine till the patient post-operatively started complaining of severe bone pains and ultimately developed chronic rejection and explanted. Maybe thus the importance of early revasc in proximal transplants. In our 13th patient, preoperatively, imaging had shown subclavian vein stenosis till origin. We had learned from our past, right transplant was not planned, rest went well. 14 transplant also went well intraoperatively. Late post-op suddenly deteriorated and got bedridden. IVIG was given, diagnosed to have critical illness, polyneuropathy and myopathy, managed by physiotherapy. Doing good. In 15 patient also, as all went well till she developed gastric symptoms, and we managed for PTLD, didn't respond to rituximab. Started on low dose chemo for lymphoma, responded and settled. So male to female transplants, please be vigilant for GI symptoms in follow-ups. A few days back, unfortunately, we lost her to suicide. Our 16th patient, a 64-year-old diabetic and renal transplant patient, had developed, everything went well transplant-wise, but developed ischemic blindness, and now uses his hand as a supportive measure. We almost thought our patients had stopped giving us pearls, but came our 17th patient, a triple amputee. We harvested extra vessels, still fell short on the right side as the donor was of short stature. Used warm saline to warm the cold transplanted hand, not a good idea. Used vein grafts liberally. Our 18th patient luckily had in-house donor, but from a 72-year-old lady, the oldest we know of. Nerve, skin tone, and color recovery is on track. Our last patient, an anesthetist by profession, was our first post-infective amputation. In unilateral transplants, it's important to repeatedly counsel the patient regarding the size and color mismatch. It's also the first time we encountered lymphedema, and she is in early post-op though. To conclude, planning should be meticulous and counseling repeated, both from the first visit to the patient's lifelong follow-up. We cannot control so many things pre-op, including NOTO, SOTO notifications, flight and patient timings, and definitely not what the patient does with the hand post-op. But once the donor hand is on table, we should aspire to have a flawless surgery. That's critical and in control. We have to be flexible, sometimes take preemptive decisions, and often seek help from donor city doctors and sometimes from our colleagues abroad. And we should persevere as a team, as complications are often noticed at the end when everyone in the team are exhausted and we have disgruntled patients waiting for surgery the next day. And yes, though the world's largest series, come on, it's just 19 patients and much remains unanswered. So let's come together and build more transplant teams, because it does turn the world around upside up for these patients, and they are our true motivators. Not far from now, we can also say, what's there in hand transplant? Thank you for your patience.